Welcome to the Hill Update. I'm your host, Dean Allison, Member of Parliament for Niagara West. Over the past 2 years, federal, provincial, and municipal governments have exercised extraordinary powers that many have found to be excessively intrusive. Civil liberties associations have raised strong concerns, describing the measures as government overreach. From rolling lockdowns to mandatory masking, from gathering restrictions to vaccine mandates and passports, from QR codes to now digital ID. It's truly unprecedented time in our nation's history. Recently, the Prime Minister invoked the Emergency Act in spite of the advice of civil liberty experts who said invoking the act was not necessary to deal with the Freedom Convoy protesters. This allowed the government to use vast new powers and keep the state of emergency going. Canadian bank accounts were frozen, often without explanation, among other government tactics to deal with the demonstrations. In Ottawa, police arrested peaceful protesters at gunpoint, police horses injured at least one woman, and unarmed protesters were beaten by police. In Alberta, 3 pastors were jailed because the provincial government took them to court, rather than relying on regular law enforcement like many other provinces did. Many civil liberties advocates saw this as clear evidence of government overreach. Canadians largely accepted vaccine passports from September 2021 to early 2022 with relatively little outcry or protest. At least that's what the legacy media wanted us to believe. This meant that the government had the power to exclude some Canadians from society over the refusal to get an injection, and this is still the case for international and interprovincial travel as well. Many large organizations and those working in federally regulated fields, such as the Federal Public Service, Canada Post, Via Rail, Bell Canada, have also fired employees for the refusal to comply. Roughly 6 million Canadians are still excluded from full participation in Canadian society because of a medical decision they have made for themselves. Critics are raising serious concerns and questions about government-imposed second-class citizen status for those who have decided to remain unvaccinated. If the loss of liberties happens to those who chose to remain unvaccinated, there are rising concerns from experts that the same thing may be repeated in other areas chosen by the government in the future. What factors will the government choose next to discriminate against a certain group of Canadians, which it deems to be non-compliant? What's the next crisis or event that the government will deem important enough to curtail the rights of Canadians? The precedent set by the actions of politicians, officials, and governments in the last 2 years has raised alarm bells domestically and internationally, with foreign politicians sounding off. Much of the concern stems from the fact that governments continue to keep vaccine passports in place long after organizations like the CDC and Health Canada have stated publicly that vaccines do not stop the spread. Vaccine passports were also kept in place even after it had become obvious to everyone that vaccines were not stopping the Delta and Omicron variants from spreading, and many vaccinated Canadians were still getting sick with COVID. Once again, what's next? A digital ID system? The digital ID and other new technologies are said to be able to empower governments to control virtually all aspects of Canadians' lives. As an example, the government could easily create a new passport to ensure that any Canadian who visits a website that is considered hateful by an arbitrarily government bureaucracy will lose a certain set of rights. Domestic and international travel can easily become a privilege and not a right for only Canadians with politically correct opinions, whether those opinions are about vaccines, immigration, abortion, lockdowns, and many other issues. Those new and bigger violations of charter rights and freedoms could be sold as presented as scientific, convenient, and for the common good, in the same way the vaccine passports were sold, promoted, and imposed. The government and the Prime Minister himself has said that he doesn't believe that what he defines as racist and misogynist, anti-science extremist should be tolerated in Canadian society. The exact quote about Canadians who chose to remain unvaccinated by the PM was this: "They are extremists who don't believe in science. They're often misogynists and often racist," said Trudeau. "It's a small group that muscles in, and we have to make a choice in terms of leaders, in terms of the country. Do we tolerate these people?" These concerning statements by the Prime Minister could be seen as another item in a now long pattern of intrusive and overreaching government, perhaps one that is comfortable with negating some of the most basic civil liberties Canadians have previously enjoyed. In order to make all these changes, however, the federal government has to vote on them in the House of Commons, which now has a de facto majority with the NDP Liberal Pact. This virtually ensures that if the federal government is bent on going down a big government path, it most certainly will get the approval in Parliament. In fact, just this week, the Prime Minister proposed to limit the remaining opposition parties and the ability to hold this government to account. Welcome back to the Hill Update. I'm your host, Dean Allison. Joining me on the show today is Rick Nicholls, member of provincial parliament and represents the riding of Chatham-Kent-Leamington, where he has represented that riding since 2011. Rick, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today. I know that you've got firsthand experience in what I described in my opening in terms of government/party overreach. You know, in order for democracy to flourish, people need to be able to challenge the government and ask questions. I know you're not alone, as other members of your caucus have either left or they've been asked to leave. For those that don't know you, Rick, let's talk a bit about your journey. I know that this happened back last year in August, so talk to us about why you're not in the caucus right now and just a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much. First of all, Dean, I want to thank you for allowing me to be on The Hill with Dean Allison. I love that. It's great. Dean, if I'll back up just a bit, when I was in caucus, I be sitting in on Zoom meetings, and of course we would have doctors from the science table giving us presentations with all kinds of charts and everything else. And I began to question exactly, well, let's talk about the clinical data, the trials that have been done. Have there been enough trials done? Do we know that these, in fact, are safe trials, or are they, in fact, just short-term? What's going on? And, of course, I would raise those questions, especially when they started talking about children, because from 12 to 17, how do we know that the clinical data, the trials, are proving to be safe and effective? And then when they went to 5 to 11, wow, I'll tell you, I just about lost it in caucus. So I was probably deemed a naysayer, an anti-vaxxer, both of which are not true at all. I have all my vaccines that I need. I just don't agree with this experimental drug. I don't want to call it a vaccine, because as you and I know, Dean, it takes 10 to 15 years to develop a thorough, proper vaccine safe for people. And of course, they have to, in fact, have developed an antigen to ensure that the disease, the vaccine doesn't cause any further problems, doesn't spread. So I questioned that. And then I had been asked by the Premier he said, Rick, in his folksy way, I need you to do me a favor. Well, what's that, Premier? I need you to get vaccinated. I said, Premier, that's going to be a problem with me, and I'll tell you why. And I explained to him why. Sadly enough, he said, well, look, I don't need an answer right away. But then he had a couple of his heavyweights try to persuade me. The second one was a gentleman by the name of Corey Tonight. Corey Tonight, as you know, is he's the campaign manager for the Re-elect Doug Ford 2022. He's also a principal in a company called Rubicon. It's a lobbyist company who, in fact, lobby for Pfizer, lobby for Johnson & Johnson, and many other big pharma. They represent over 100 different companies. However, he called me up and he said this: you have 72 hours to get vaccinated, or you will be sitting with the independents. And I said, excuse me, what are you talking about? Who gives you the power to remove an elected official from caucus? He says, that's the way it is. He said, do you want to hear my story? He said, I'm not interested. And I told him, I said, you'll hear my story whether you want to hear it or not. And so I pushed back on the bully. And I basically explained to him, I said, listen, in my opinion, there hasn't been enough clinical research done to ensure that these particular injections are safe and effective. Now, those two words, safe and effective, were words that the Minister of Health, Christine Elliott, continually used she's been using it since day one. And I'm saying, show me the data. Show me the data. And Pfizer, as you and I know, held back until just recently with your court orders. And it's been like over 1,900 different adverse effects. Oh, maybe they're not as safe and effective. However, I went before the cameras, made my announcement that I was not going to get the injection. And of course, in business, in politics, as you know, Dean, there are what we call intended issues that we say, okay, I know that this is a problem, let's fix it. Unintended consequences and intended consequences. Well, it was an intended consequence because I was told if I didn't get the shot, I had 72 hours to get the shot, or I would be in what I would call excommunicated.
Rick, I'm going to have to hold that thought. We got to go to break right now. Welcome back to the Hill Update. I've got Rick Nicholls joining me on the show today. Rick, thanks for being here. I know that there's been a lot of talk about Bill 100, just recently passed on the Ontario legislature. That's the Keeping Ontario Open for Business Act. So I've heard conflicting reports about, people being concerned that there's a bunch of overreach. I've heard other people say, listen, it's really just about making sure our borders don't get blocked. Any insight in terms of your perspective on what Bill 100 is about or what it's not about?
Great question, Dean. The first thing that I would say, though, is that Bill 100 and the Emergency Act that Prime Minister Trudeau put in place, which fortunately got word that the Senate were going to defeat it, so he pulled it back. All of that could have been prevented had Premier Ford and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had gone and just met with the trucker convoy up in Ottawa. All of that could have been eliminated and millions of dollars would have been saved. So Bill 100 comes up. And Bill 100, the government says it's just simply a bill to ensure that we cannot have any blockades on any access points from, say, U.S. to Canada.
Like borders, sure, like borders, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and that was a huge overreach, I think, on behalf of the government, because people are saying if they can do that, what else can they do? Because basically they've given the policing authorities, carte blanche to be able to go up and perhaps even seize your vehicle, take your license away, impose major fines. And it's not just because people are very concerned that now they can maybe come into, you're having a gathering, even at your home in your backyard, and the police get wind of it because it's kind of a protest. It's perceived to be a protest group. They could come in and create all kinds of havoc. The government says, no, that's not what it is. But you know what? In my years of experience, being in Toronto at Queen's Park, and I'm sure your experience on Parliament Hill, what is said isn't always what happens.
Well, that's a good point, Rick. I mean, what as legislators we have to worry about is unintended consequences. I think you were talking a bit about that before. So I guess my question is, we talk about unintended consequences, the ability to possibly seize, maybe to suspend licenses without due process. Is there a concern there that maybe due process won't be there and, things can be seized arbitrarily without going through that process? Is that part of the concern? Yeah.
Absolutely right. The one thing that really concerned me was, the use of inflammatory language, with the trucking convoy up in Ottawa. Now, you were there, Dean. You saw it. Was there a lot of violence? Was there, mayhem in the streets? And so, no. Were the people of Ottawa slightly inconvenienced? Perhaps if they wanted to go downtown. Well, welcome to the nation's capital, where protests happen all the time. But this was a major one. I understand that. But to hear what the Liberals and even the NDP and even Premier Ford used the inflammatory language, I thought to myself, no, you don't use that kind of language on people who are peacefully demonstrating. These convoy people were feeding the poor, for example, and helping the homeless, cleaning up after themselves. I mean, does that sound like an illegal protest to you? Not to me, it doesn't.
So I guess my question is, do you feel... is there anywhere in the Act, and I realize that, once again, these acts come into force, and so we may not know for years because there may not be another opportunity for a while. Are you concerned about the fact that, people could maybe, and you alluded to, the possibility of someone gathered in their backyards, but is there always the possibility that people could have their assets sealed without the due process.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, we saw what Trudeau did with regards to freezing the assets. All the money of the GoFundMe, and then they froze that, which was a few $1 million, I guess. And then all of a sudden, then they went back in and said, "Well, who donated?" And they started freezing bank accounts of people who actually donate. Well, if they can do that, if they have that power, which is, to me, that's totally undemocratic. It's totally totalitarianism. It's a case where, in fact, they shouldn't be allowed to do that. What's mine is mine, and we elect you, Mr. Trudeau. Well, some people did anyway, to in fact, run our country. Well, then run it, but run it in a democratic way. That is totally undemocratic.
Yeah, and I think, at the end of the day, you and I would both agree we shouldn't see our borders blocked. I mean, that's not right. We have to deal with the services of getting things back and forth. But obviously, when it comes to peaceful protest, we shouldn't have any issues. Listen, let's go to break, Rick. When we come back, let's talk a bit about digital ID that's been in the news quite a bit, and maybe just get a status update from you on where that is at the province. Welcome back to the Hill Update. Joining me on the show today is Rick Nicholls, who's been the member of provincial parliament since 2011 in Chatham, Kent area down in southwestern Ontario. So my question to you, let's talk about digital IDs a bit. Rick, we've heard lots. I know that the various provinces are looking at it, federally looking at it. Let's speak specifically about Ontario. So what exactly is a digital ID and what is the status? What should we be concerned? I mean, timelines. I know they wanted to roll this out back in 2021. Here we are in 2022. They haven't said a lot about it in terms of timing. So what's your understanding? And why don't we just start with the first question? So why does government feel that the digital ID is important?
Well, they'll sell you on the advantages of digital ID, where you don't have to carry and worry about your passport. You don't have to worry about your driver's license, your health card, those types of things. I questioned the premier in question period back, perhaps about a month or so ago, a little over a month ago. And I asked him directly. Of course, he punted it to his associate minister of digital ID or digital government. And of course, I didn't get a proper answer, because my biggest concern was this. People are very, very concerned. My health records are my business. They are nobody else's business, just like everyone else. However, the government overreach once again, said, well, if you want to go to a ball game, you want to go to a hockey game, you want to go to a concert, you have to show proof that you're vaccinated. Excuse me, I'm now showing some person, at a gate what my health records are, that I've been vaccinated. Well, again, I've been injected. I haven't been vaccinated. Well, of course, you know as well as I do, I have not had that. Now, my point is that I then questioned, I said, well, will one's health records be on this digital? They danced around it. And they wouldn't tell us. So again, for example, if your status is on there and you say haven't had your third booster, now here we are in the long-term care, and with some people, we're looking at a fourth booster, a fourth shot. Wow, come on. Again, I think this is tremendous government overreach. They're putting way too much information on this thing, and it needs to stop. And my party, the Ontario Party, is vehemently opposed to digital ID.
So my question, I guess what you're saying is, if you use your health card for a specific service, that's one thing. But when you start connecting all these things together, now people have access to all your information, not just health, but your driver's license, maybe parking, all the things you talk about. So that's maybe the greater concern, is the lack of privacy over time, because of these things all be interconnected.
Yes, and I believe too that with technology advancing at the lightning speed rate that it is these days, is technology good? Yeah, it is good, but it's got to be used for the right purposes. And I think that there's the danger that, and we've seen this at the federal level and even at the provincial level, where in fact it could be used for devious reasons. And of course, then that is nobody's business. And I don't want all my personal information on a cloud somewhere where someone who is tech savvy can go up there and pull down anything and everything, where they know everything about me, from my wife, my how long I've been married, my kids, my grandkids, what kind of car I drive, driver record, the whole thing. Not necessary, in my opinion.
Well, and these things always start off as voluntary, right? Always, and that's where it leads to first voluntary and then required. So, any idea timeline implementation? Obviously, this was supposed to roll out late last year. There's some other glitches with other things, and as technology is being developed, we got about a minute left. So, any ideas on the current timeline for implementation?
Well, I recall that the Premier had stated that we're looking at the end of 2022, where a lot of this will already be implemented. And that's a very scary thought for many, many people.
All right, so any final thoughts for us? We got about 50 seconds left, just in terms of where we're heading as we move down this path in terms of government overreach, et cetera.
Well, you know what, again, when we talk about government overreach, the one thing that really concerns me is the failure on mainstream media to in fact report what I call the truth and the way things really, really are. This is what I really appreciate, yourself and what you're doing, Dean, simply because you are what I would call the alternative media, and you're getting the facts out there. You're asking the challenging questions. People need to be more informed, and of course, currently with mainstream media, they're not getting it right now. So again, I'm very, very concerned about a lot of this. It's interesting how. Since I kind of went after the mainstream media back, maybe a couple of months ago, they ignore me at the.
Rick, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today. Lots of changes coming up with new legislation and digital IDs. Always things to keep in mind that we always need to be careful with government overreach. Thank you very much for joining me on the Hill Update.